I'd love to start with a recap of your session at AAIC. Can you please just give us a quick overview of what was shared in that past, present, future Alzheimer's session?
Yeah, I'm happy to, and I was so pleased to be a part of a panel with such an august group of individuals. It was a great update for me about statistical thinking, biomarkers, and our engagement with the community. So a privilege to be there. The premise of the session was to do a retrospective, to look back over the last 25 years across a variety of our activities and ask the question, what did we do? What did we do well? What did we feel that there was room for improvement for? What did we do badly, candidly, occasionally as well? And it was a nice opportunity for me just to put the pitch for cognition and function. And I ended up focusing on cognition because it's a fairly pithy session and you want to make it relatively brief and accessible. But the role and opportunity I had was to say, well, when we've looked at cognition in people living with Alzheimer's disease, what have we typically done in clinical and academic research? Does that contrast with our experience of trying to develop new therapies? And if it does, what's the areas of difference? And do we think we can learn any more from the academic experience that we could import into clinical drug trials? And the bottom line, I think, on it was that there's been a fidelity in the outcome metrics we've used. So the academic and clinical research has, I think, come on leaps and bounds. We have a very good understanding of how even very early stage patients will present to us now. And in the academic and clinical world, we've harnessed, for example, the use of digital assessments when that's been very successful. So that was the opportunity to say, what have we done academically and clinically? What have we learned? And then to look at our experience of running drug trials. And the retrospective essentially said, well, there have been measures that have been very commonly used. The Alzheimer's Disease Assessment Scale, the cognitive subscale from that, the ADAS-COG, the Clinical Dementia Rating Scale, the sum of boxes variant that's become very much the vogue in the last few years. And I just by necessity of having to be fairly brief, I focused very much on the ADAS-COG. And it seems like it's a pretty good measure of memory, which is, when it was first published in 1984, was, I think, most people's understanding of what the earliest presentational challenges were. But 2025, we've come a very long way. We now know that people can present early with difficulties with concentration, difficulties with their planning, their thinking, difficulties with communication, difficulties acting purposefully on the world. And the opportunity to look back and evaluate what we've done did make that stand out rather, that whilst we've done a very good job of capturing these things in academic and clinical research, we've not done a terribly good job of that in the clinical drug trials we've run. So that was the real obvious opportunity. When we look across the two areas of research, in clinical drug trials, we've got extraordinarily sophisticated molecules, we've got amazing biomarkers, we've got incredible neuroimaging, but the functional and cognitive measures really didn't seem to be fit for purpose any longer. And the resolve was, what's the opportunity going forward? Maybe we can fix that by moving the dial a little.
Was the audience receptive in the clinical trial space? I'm always curious that the different perspectives of the regulatory groups and the drug developers and each of the different bodies. Did it feel like those who were in there, who were from the trial space, were receptive to the ideas of bringing over, if you will, some of those tools from
Mm.
that clinical and academic research space?
Yeah, I'm very pleased to say there was that warm reception for the idea, and I'd also want to say, go on the record and say that my interactions with biotech companies, pharmaceutical companies, at an individual and a study team level, there's very little difference of opinion on this. It's actually quite easy to carry the room with the idea that our metrics should have good content validity, measure all the things we think that are relevant. Which begs the question, why are we still using a 50-year-old test to screen people in and a 40-year-old test to look at efficacy? And there's just that conservatism, familiarity, I think, is really driving this. So we try to come at this from various stakeholders' perspectives. The FDA are often held out as an organization that requires the use of these measures, but when we unpacked that's really not the case. And in fact, I've got slides from 2008 that say the contrary. And we also kicked around this idea that in 2018, the FDA wrote draft guidance which said sensitive neuropsychological measures. They said much the same last year. So if we thought about what the blocks to progression are, we ended up concluding that we have such a rich history of using these tests, and therefore a lot of data with which we can model what we expect to see in future trials, that as somebody said recently at another meeting, these metrics have a gravitational pull, and elsewhere they're described as time honored. So I think there's a recognition that we could, should, and must do better. But there's a natural conservatism, I think, in clinical drug development, which makes people tend to reach for the things that we've used before. And I guess the argument would be, well, now we're showing efficacy on these metrics. Maybe that's the validation we need. I perfectly accept that, but there's still the opportunity to do better, because there are things about early presentation Alzheimer's disease we would routinely assess in clinic and in any academic research we conducted, but we don't measure at all, or at least not well, when we run clinical drug trials. So I buy the argument, I get the perspectives of the different stakeholders, but you're still left with this really strong sense that we could, should, and must do better.
That's